I'm Dr. John Yaffé, conductor, pianist, and assistant professor and co-course director for music at Coventry University, England. I first would like to thank Heidi Pegler and the entire AOTOS team, as well as the Eurovox team, for inviting me to give a presentation at this year's Eurovox conference. And thanks to all of you, and especially our European colleagues, for being with me for my talk, which I have entitled Performing the Yiddish Folksong, a repertoire finally steps into the light. Now, I'm married to a professional singer, and I've had a lifelong passion for the human voice, for the lyric theater, and for the vocal repertoire in general. But one area of research that has occupied me especially intensively in recent years has been that of the folk song in classical arrangement. More specifically, I've been interested in a particular set of arrangements of folk songs in the Yiddish language that has only recently come to light again. But let me back up for a moment just to give you a bit of context. Through the centuries, Jewish folk songs in the Yiddish language have been passed from generation to generation, from parent or grandparent to child, through the Jewish congregational community and in occasional performance within the relatively small circle of traditional Jews. However, as those people whose mother tongue is Yiddish have gradually passed away, the memory of the Yiddish folk song gradually fades as well. And so fades an important part of the chronicle of a people. And sadly, many of these songs are no longer heard at all. For the past 100 years, many dedicated researchers and archivists have collected and transcribed Yiddish folk song melodies and texts. Most of these transcriptions are published in lead sheet form, melody and text only. Such renderings are useful for archival and research purposes, but any use of them for performance purposes requires the hand of a musician able to flesh them out into viable accompaniments for performances on the desired instruments. And as such, the songs are subject to the unpredictability of the hand responsible for their arrangements. Most Yiddish folk song anthologies offer only cursory piano accompaniments, as do the arrangements of most of the composers of the, quote, New Jewish School, also known as the St. Petersburg School of the early 20th century. Even some better-known composers have tried their hand at musicalizing Yiddish. For example, Dmitri Shostakovich used Yiddish texts, but he created original melodies on them. Darius Milhaud composed all his poèmes juifs to French translations of Yiddish, and Maurice Ravel's two Yiddish settings altered the original modal melodies. Others, such as Victor Ullmann and Stefan Volpe, tried their hand at setting intact Yiddish folk song melodies, but their combined output amounts to less than a dozen songs. On the other hand, composers such as Johannes Brahms, Benjamin Britten, Aaron Copland, Antonin Dvorak, Ralph Vaughan Williams, and others embraced the folk songs of their native lands and fashioned sets of masterful and oft-performed concert arrangements of them for recital performance. As a result, those songs have gained recognition worldwide, but this has not been the case with the Yiddish folk song. The exposure of these songs to a wider public has been extremely limited. They have been caught within the small circles of Jewish families, congregations, social events, klezmer camps, festivals of Jewish music, archives, and conferences on Yiddish music. Unlike the folk song arrangements of the composers mentioned above, they have not been disseminated through the channels by which all other significant song repertoire gets its global exposure, and that is the thousands of song recitals performed each year by trained student and professional singers around the world. We have simply lacked a significant body of finely crafted Yiddish folksong arrangements by a single composer-arranger that would attract trained singers to this important vocal literature. Enter Robert de Cormier. In the late 1950s, the late great American conductor, composer, arranger Robert de Cormier, who early on became very active in Jewish music circles in New York, was commissioned to write vocal instrumental arrangements of 42 Yiddish folk songs specifically for 3 LP recordings by 2 singers, the Austrian-born American Martha Schlamme, who commissioned de Cormier to write 2 sets of 16 songs each for her 1957 and 1959 Vanguard recordings, and the Ukrainian-born Israeli Netanya Davrat, who commissioned de Cormier to create 12 arrangements for her 1963 Vanguard recording. Those recordings fell out of print soon after their release, and de Cormier's arrangements were sadly never performed live. Then, in 1999, the above-mentioned Vanguard LPs were handed to my wife, soprano Juliana Janes Yaffé, at a ceremony in which she won a Professional Achievement Award. Apparently, the person who handed those LPs to her had a hunch that Juliana might be the ideal interpreter to revive the de Cormier arrangements. Several days later, Juliana and I set the turntable in motion and listened in a state of utter amazement and enchantment, I have to say, to all 42 song arrangements. Coincidentally, at the same moment in time, Juliana had been thinking about what the profile of her next solo recital program should be. And without even searching for it, an exciting opportunity had presented itself to her. A program made up entirely of the marvelous de Cormier arrangements. A program that would introduce the concert-going public to this musically excellent, thematically varied, passionate, poignant, poetic, philosophical, playful, sometimes disturbing, but always heartfelt slice of cultural history. I set out to search for the performance materials for de Cormier's arrangements, and it led me to the American state of Vermont, where de Cormier had gone into semi-retirement. In my phone conversation with de Cormier, I expressed our interest in performing his arrangements, and I inquired as to where we could buy or rent the vocal scores and instrumental parts. What happened next shocked me. With a hearty laugh, he said, "Those materials have been sitting in my storage cupboard for more than 40 years. I'd be thrilled if someone performed them." Apparently, the arrangements had been written and used only for those LP recording sessions, but never performed live. Fortunately, however, he had taken the materials home after the sessions, and unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for us, they languished in that storage cupboard for all those years. The upshot of my phone conversation with de Cormier was an agreement by which he gave Juliana and me exclusive performance and publication rights to his arrangements, and in return, we agreed to do 3 things. 1, perform the songs as widely as possible, undertake a new commercial recording of the songs, and finally, arrange for the publication of the songs. Some weeks later, de Cormier met us in a restaurant in New York City with a stack of manuscripts under his arm and thus began the Yiddish Folksong project. It would be remiss of me not to mention at this juncture that when talking about Robert de Cormier, we are talking about one of the most highly regarded American musicians of the second half of the 20th century. One would be hard-pressed to find anyone in American choral circles or in the area of folk song literature who does not know who Robert de Cormier is. A Juilliard School graduate, he was a major player in the politically charged folk music revival of the 1950s and 60s, working with such artists as Harry Belafonte, Pete Seeger, Peter, Paul and Mary, and others, including his own Robert de Cormier singers. His contribution to the editing, arranging, and publishing of folk song literature is immeasurable. The magic of de Cormier's arrangements in general, and especially with regard to those being discussed here, is that they possess the rigor and integrity of classical composition while retaining the accessibility of folk music. De Cormier demonstrates an ability to stay out of the way of the essential flexibility inherent in this style of folk music. He avoids bogging the song down with heavy-handed musical setting. He is able to enhance the environment in which the original material lives through an attractive, poetic, and nuanced musical setting, goals that are not easily achieved. But now the real work began for me, the restoration of the arrangements from all the disparate pencil and pen manuscripts, scores, and parts. The process took years. Juliana's busy performance obligations necessitated her having to learn the songs over a protracted time period. But on the 13th of March, 2005, the first live performance of de Cormier's arrangements took place in New York City more than 45 years after their creation, with Juliana singing and the instrumental ensemble under my direction. In bringing these songs into mainstream concert settings, and in preparing published versions of them for concert performance, we knew full well that we were treading on slippery ground. First, one needs only to consider that unlike most languages, which are spoken by the residents of a particular area or by members of a particular nationality, Yiddish, at the height of its usage, that is, prior to the Holocaust, was spoken by an estimated 11 million people of different nationalities all around the world. I should note that the Holocaust dealt an almost lethal blow to the Yiddish language, because today only about 1 million people worldwide speak the language. From its origins in the West Central German Rhine region in the 10th or 11th century, Yiddish fused the existing Middle High German with Hebraic elements, as well as French and Italian Jewish dialects brought by immigrants to that area. As a result of persecution, then, in the 13th and 14th centuries, large numbers of Jews were forced into the regions of Eastern Europe, where the language permanently assimilated elements of various Slavic languages. In practice, this means that different dialects of Yiddish exist, and that there exists disagreements on what defines, let's say, correct pronunciation of song texts, especially those that are anonymous and whose date of origin and regional provenance is unknown. And going back to those LPs where Marta Schlamme sings the beloved Rozinka's mit Mandlin, it sounds different than when Natanya Davrat sings Rozinka's mit Mandlin. So, which one is authentic? Although both Juliana and I are Jewish, and I had grown up hearing Yiddish at home, though Juliana hadn't, we couldn't help asking ourselves, what is authentic Yiddish folk song style? Juliana already had a mastery of Yiddish pronunciation, and naturally she understood the meaning of every word of every song text she sang. Still, we were preparing to perform these songs in New York, the seat of the largest single Jewish population in the world still speaking, or at least familiar with Yiddish, and we found ourselves wound up and rather stressed over the question of authenticity. With time, however, we realized that reaching for, quote, authenticity was a futile endeavor. And this is why. Isn't it true that as soon as one moves beyond the framework in which a song was originally created, and it was not recorded at the moment of creation, literal authenticity is lost? Isn't it true that once a lullaby, for example, improvised by a mother who sings over a baby's cradle, gets passed to the woman next door, moves on to another village or another country, or is passed down to another generation, any claim of authenticity must necessarily be put into question? It follows, then, that authenticity can only be imagined, supported, naturally, by whatever knowledge is available relating to the historical, cultural, aesthetic realities of the time in which the song had been created. Even so, what do you do in the case of an anonymous song, where you don't know when, where, or how the melody and text came into being? This is not the music of a German people in a German land or Chinese people in a Chinese land. This is the music of Jewish people living in many different lands around the globe, music that organically absorbed, digested, and became integrated into the musical environment in which it found itself. Music that was then transmitted across borders and even across oceans. To me, the critical question is this: does it really matter? It is certainly true that one should do a background check on every song that one intends to sing in public. One should give oneself fully to the history, language, sentiment, atmosphere, and aesthetic of each song. One should try to become an inhabitant of the world in which each song resides. But have audiences really enjoyed the songs of Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, Wolf, Tchaikovsky, Fauré, Debussy, and others any less just because we haven't enough reliable documentation to enable, quote, historically informed performance? I personally don't think so. In the end, if we hadn't believed that there was some enduring universality inherent in these Yiddish folk songs outside of their original cultural, historical, musical context, just like every other body of great song literature, we would never have embarked on what was essentially a gigantic experiment in the communicative power of these songs on the world stage. And since no good deed goes unpunished, as the saying goes, after the first performance in New York City, we were paid a visit in our dressing room by a gentleman who had marked up his printed translation sheet in red pen and proceeded to tell Juliana which Yiddish words she had mispronounced. She simply wasn't singing the Yiddish that his mother or his grandmother had spoken to him as a youngster. Thankfully, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, or YIVO, in New York City, had already devised guidelines in the 1930s for what they called standard Yiddish pronunciation. And it was those guidelines that Juliana was using as her point of departure, incorporating additional idiomatic components of Yiddish phonology. Then, in 2013, our Yiddish Folksong project attracted the attention of the New York-based Endeavor Foundation, which expressed to us its firm belief in both the educational significance of the project as well as its dedication to cross-cultural understanding. The result has been a collaboration which since 2014 is manifested in full funding of the research, restoration, performance, recording, publication, and educational components of the project. Thus, my talk today follows on the heels of the release of Volume 1 of the Yiddish Folksong Project Anthology. It introduces, for the first time in published form, 18 of the 42 arrangements done by de Cormier between 1957 and 1963. And it's accompanied by a new recording of the corresponding songs with Juliana singing them. And this is the first publication of its kind, as we know of no other anthology of Yiddish folk song arrangements with this volume's distinctive features. That is, a large collection of finely crafted concert arrangements of Yiddish folk songs by a single recognized arranger, conductor, composer, intended to be sung in the original Yiddish by trained singers, available in versions for instrumental ensemble and voice, but also for piano, violin, and voice, and for piano and voice, with a comprehensive set of pedagogical components such as a Yiddish pronunciation guide, a comparison of Yiddish and German, a brief history of the Yiddish language, and a three-pronged translation of each song text. A, an IPA transliteration, B, a word-for-word translation, and C, an idiomatic translation. And free downloadable MP3 recordings of all songs in this volume, both in sung versions and in accompaniment-only versions as aids to learning the songs. With the release of this anthology, singing teachers, professional singers, singers in training, and repetiteurs will now have access to a wonderful new body of vocal literature from a pedagogically conceived publication. My mention of the recent release of the anthology has but only one purpose: the broader dissemination of this rich cultural and musical heritage to a global community. It's my sincere hope that singers around the world will heartily embrace this repertoire and enchant their audiences with it. Robert de Cormier has left us a veritable treasure trove of Yiddish folk song arrangements, with his unique blend of intellect, emotional intelligence, insight, artistry, capacity for nuance, inventiveness, and with impeccable craft, he has furthered and enriched the folk song arrangement repertoire immeasurably. And now, after 60 years, his arrangements are finally, for the first time, handed over to you, the singer, or the voice student, or the voice teacher, or the coach, or the scholar, for your artistic fulfillment, for your pleasure, and for the pleasure of your audiences. May these arrangements enrich your lives and your repertoire as they have ours. And if you're interested in finding out more about these songs and about this anthology, you can go to the website on your screen at the end of this presentation. But meanwhile, thanks for joining me for this presentation. Here's to good health and to good music making.
Spiel Balalaika, Freilach soll sein.